Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to this reception in honor of our anniversary. We started exactly a year ago, and it's just wonderful to see that we have now alumni and friends and supporters from around Hong Kong and even around the globe. So I will now invite our president, Professor Tony Chan, to give a few remarks and maybe reflect a little bit on our program, and then I will also, chip in. So let us welcome Professor Chan.
Thank you very much, Angelina. It was just like yesterday. I remember almost exactly a year ago. Many of us were at the Asia Society site to kick off the LAPP program. I remember Andy Hamilton, was also there, the Vice Chancellor of Oxford. So for those of you who were there, you probably remember this is a program we put forth, by the way, with the very generous support of Vincent Lo here, and under the directorship of Angelina and our EVPP, Wei Shi, who is sitting there. Our ambition, still have to be realized, of course, is to have a program that ultimately aims to be among the best in the world, but with a unique sort of Hong Kong-Asia perspective. I think there's a lot that we can learn from other places, but I think this region, Hong Kong and China in particular, also have a lot to, for us, actually, Hong Kongers to know about, but also to provide for the rest of the world. And we want to provide a intellectual platform, one that is informed by opinion from all directions, so that we can provide a resource for Hong Kong public officials so that they can do their job, they can lead Hong Kong in a better way. I think that's sort of, in a succinct way, what we attempt to do. I've had the privilege to meet several of the programs that we put up. I actually gave a lecture, so I'm kind of a professor in that program, and I was very impressed by the question, the quality, the commitment, the curiosity of the alumni of this program. And I think today is also a reunion of that, in addition to the celebration. So we hope this will continue. We need your input. We need your support. We need you to spread the word. Our goal is to provide the best resource for Hong Kong and beyond. I think that's what we want to do. Any way you want to think we can improve, let us know. I think the program today is a good example. I just met Professor Goldstone. We just met, but I sort of know a little bit about what he's going to talk about or his background. Very experienced person with a global view about, I think your expertise is revolutions. Okay. But you'll hear a little bit about his perspective of what has been happening in Hong Kong the last, few months or a year, actually. I think that's the kind of quality program that we want to put up for this program. Okay, so Angelina, I'll pass it back to you. All welcome. Okay, yeah.
I just want to reflect a little bit on the past year, the accomplishments that we have made, which actually even surprised myself. We have run nonstop ever since I was appointed to this position, and with the able assistance of my staff, we have worked extremely hard to get this program up and running. When we first started, I still remember the trepidation with which we've launched the first program. And we thought, who in the world would want to come to a program like this when there are numerous other programs in the market, And so actually I was asked this many times, and I said, well, we just have to do it better. And I think we did. So the students kept coming back. We invented more programs. We were very, very fortunate to be working with some of the top minds in the world. And they came from Oxford, from Cambridge, from University of Tokyo, from Berkeley, from MIT, from Beijing, from Singapore, and from our own university, of course, HKUST, as well as other sister institutions in Hong Kong. So we have got a global spread of outstanding academics who have been very willing to contribute to our endeavor, because I think primarily because of the thought behind it, because of the vision, because we really all want to make Hong Kong a better place. And I think with the 5 executive programs that we have accomplished, ranging in topics from urban planning, from global economy to social protestation, to innovation, and to the rise of China. All of these programs have drawn a very enthusiastic response from our participants, and actually among our faculty, I see some of our own faculty, as well as the Consul General of Singapore, who is one of our very distinguished speakers as well on the program. And we also had the very enthusiastic support of our board members, to whom I'm extremely grateful. Dr. Vincent Lo, of course, the sponsor of our program, Dr. Raymond Chan, Sir David Akers-Jones, Nelson Chow, John Chan, as well as Peggy Liu and Roger Goodman, and of course, our own Executive Vice President, Wei Shi. I should also thank Eden Woon and also, of course, President Tony Chan for their unstinting support for the program. I think that for a program of this size, which is minuscule, the support that we've gotten has been tremendous, and we hope that with the very small step that we've taken, we will be able to make a huge impact. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, who's very boldly confronted something that is uppermost on our minds, and that is the Hong Kong protests this year. That is still, I think, reflections on this movement is ongoing and will not stop. And we are very fortunate to have Professor Jack Goldstone throw out the first ideas about ways to think about this protest movement. Professor Jack Goldstone, as you know, is the Hazel Professor of Public Policy and a senior scholar at George Mason University and a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. He has won many major prizes for his work, and he's gotten grants from genius foundations such as MacArthur Foundation, Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, U.S. Institute of Peace, and National Science Foundation. So you have that bio in front of you. So I will not read out all the accomplishments that he's had, but everything that he's done has been challenging and bold. So let us welcome Professor Goldstone.
Well, it's really my pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Professor Yi, President John, Vice President Eden, Provost Shi, and Dr. Lo for making this visit possible. China's always been very special to me. My parents met in Shanghai during World War II. So if not for Shanghai, I wouldn't be here today. My parents moved to San Francisco after the war, where I was born and raised, and my father continued to work in the import-export business, making frequent trips to Hong Kong. So much so that even as a young boy in San Francisco, I grew up surrounded by Chinese furniture, lacquer screens, spent a lot of time in Chinatown hearing the lilt of Cantonese, seeing the ducks strung up in the window, and of course seeing the hills, the skyscrapers, and the bay. So when I come to Hong Kong, in many ways it feels like coming home, although a much larger, grander, more modern version of the home I once knew. Now, my topic today is a challenging one for all of us. I'm not going to say anything about who is right, who is wrong. This is an internal affair for China and Hong Kong. And it would be entirely inappropriate for me as an American and outsider to try and take a position. But I will point out that these are confusing events. When the Arab revolts broke out in 2010, 2011, many people thought they would be peaceful revolutions leading to democracy in the Middle East. That did not turn out to be the case. When the protests grew in size in Hong Kong and developed some intense confrontations with the police, people were concerned that the Hong Kong protests would perhaps mushroom into something violent and chaotic and unsettling to the order of Hong Kong, which did not happen either. So in politics, just like in economics, being a contrarian is often not a bad thing to be. Fortunately, we do have scientific research on the modes of protest and revolution that we can draw on. And my role today is to speak as a scholar of social movement, social protest, and social conflict, and give you my perspectives on how I have tried to come to understand what has been happening in Hong Kong. I think it is fascinating, and the context is quite interesting. The first thing I want to point out is that the Hong Kong protests are in fact part of a global protest cycle that has been unfolding for the last couple of years. I think part of the problem that people are facing all around the world is that broad trends in the global economy are creating problems for the middle class, both in emerging market countries and in developed ones. All of them face a world in which technology and globalization are putting pressure on jobs. And demographics are slowing growth and imposing a particularly difficult situation on the young. On the one hand, young people are waiting for this very large cohort in their 50s and 60s, of which I'm one, to get out of the way, which we're not doing. Our nest eggs were depleted in the recession. We're living longer, feeling better, so we continue to work. But companies are not facing expanding markets in much of the world because population growth has slowed, especially since the recession, growth has been slowing down. So companies are not hiring additional workers. So it's a very difficult situation for young people seeking to enter the job market. And you see this talking to young people in Japan, in Israel, in Brazil, in Hong Kong. It really is a global phenomenon. Now, add to this the phenomenon of rising inequality, and the middle class everywhere is growing anxious. They're worried that their governments are not doing enough to support middle class opportunities and growth. In many places, both democracies and partial democracies, including a list of cities and countries here, Brazil, Turkey, Bosnia, Thailand, Taiwan, and others, people have protested whenever they felt that their government is not being sufficiently accountable and responsible to their interests in opportunities and growth. The triggers for protests are different in different countries. It might be excess spending on the World Cup in Brazil, or the closure of a much-loved public park in Turkey. In Hong Kong, the decision to restrict nominations of the leader of Hong Kong was taken as a signal that popular accountability in Hong Kong's governance would be limited, and this triggered protests. In the end, the protest didn't lead to a change in that decision, but I think in many ways, this is likely only one phase in this ongoing protest cycle. And in fact, Hong Kong, as you know, has had previous protests, 2003, 2012. As long as the kind of global economic malaise lingers and the debate over how the basic law provisions for choosing leaders will be implemented, there's the possibility for renewed protests when the people of Hong Kong feel their leaders are not being responsive. Now, this global economic malaise is actually something serious. I worry about this as well, all of us interested in development and economic growth. Some people have called this a new Gilded Age. The popular economist Thomas Piketty has argued that inequality has grown worse than at any time since the late 19th century. But in some ways, it's even worse for ordinary workers. If you look at the gain in average income during the Gilded Age in the United States, the years 1870 to 1890, it was a difficult time with labor protests and a lot of financial panics in the 70s and 90s. But still, over this period, for 2 decades, there was a total gain in average annual incomes of almost 20%. That's not what we see now. From 1990 to 2010, average annual incomes in the United States, the world's leading economy in terms of mature, developed industrial societies, average growth was minimal, less than 2% total over 2 decades. No wonder people are anxious and angry. Now, this is not because the economy as a whole has faltered. Here's the growth of productivity in the United States since 1980. Here's the growth in GDP per capita, which was fine until the last few years of the recession. But for this entire period, median US wages in constant dollars have been flat. So again, economic performance is really letting ordinary workers down. Young people are very anxious whether they will have opportunities to grow their incomes and seize the American dream, the Chinese dream, the European dream. All of these seem to be in some danger. Now, I said I've looked at protests and revolutions. The Arab revolt surprised us. They did develop into violent civil wars and revolutions. The crisis is still ongoing in Libya, Syria. We have an authoritarian regime take power in Egypt that is arguably even more militaristic than the Mubarak regime that was overthrown. What happened there? Well, those were true revolutions. The same is true in Ukraine. In these instances, social change was undertaken by broad coalitions, urban groups, rural groups, groups expanding different religions, a wide social compact. And they targeted regimes that were personalist, dominated by a single individual. They were closed political systems with no voice, little previous experience of democracy. And they were deeply corrupt systems that operated solely for the benefit of the personal ruler, the family, and the cronies. These revolutions pitted that individual and their system against the broader population that felt shut out. The protests I've talked about in this global protest wave are quite different. They tend to be urban and middle class, and they seek changes in policies or processes. They aim at a course correction, if you will, to achieve more accountable and responsible governance. They are not aiming to overthrow the system as a whole, but they're asking for the government to listen more carefully to what leading members of the middle class would like to see the government do. So there's a substantial difference. And I think it's very clear that in Hong Kong, the protests were all about a change in process. What was the issue? It was how was the process of selecting the chief executive going to develop? It wasn't an effort to change the government system as a whole. It was much more incremental and hence not revolutionary. Now, it was disturbing, to be sure. It's always disturbing to see an occupation of public space, to see a kind of disorder. Although I have to say, I think looking closely, and I was here in October during the protests, both the protesters and the police have reason to be proud of how they conducted themselves. The protesters especially were the most orderly, well-disciplined protests over a very sustained period that I have seen. In my country, we've recently had a national wave of protests over police treatment of minority suspects. You've heard about this, I'm sure. Several black civilians were killed by excessive use of police force, and there have been massive protests starting in Ferguson, Missouri, spreading to New York. Now, in these protests, people looted stores, set police cars on fire, repeated clashes, violence, many people injured, a lot of property damaged. Much worse chaos, if you will, than in Hong Kong. But no one in America was worried that the government would fall or that people were somehow attacking the American system. It was very clear that people were unhappy with how authority was being exercised in certain cases. They were making their anger known, And those protests will probably lead to some changes in police training, in police procedure, in the accountability for police processes, maybe even putting cameras on the caps or waistbands of police when they're apprehending suspects. So that will be probably a good outcome overall. But for Americans as a whole, we may deplore some of the consequences of those protests, but we know that protest itself is essential to keep our government on track. Now, rulers are always interested in stability. And so I'm going to give you my little disquisition on two different kinds of political stability. Nations can be ordered according to a very rigid rule of law. That operates something like a pile of boulders stacked up high, and it looks very solid and strong. The problem is once you start moving even a few boulders a little bit, you can get a rock slide. So stability in this case means keeping every component in its place and not allowing much movement. It is a kind of stability, to be sure, but it is very rigid, and once undermined, tends to lead to a quite dramatic collapse. In contrast, you can have stability that is much more dynamic, the stability of what I call stability of a glass of water. After all, a glass of water can be shaken, it can be stirred, you can pour in additional fluid, and within a lot of reasonable boundaries, you can't flip everything upside down and disrupt it, but within a lot of boundaries, you can have a lot of motion and movement and change, and yet, once things settle down, the glass of water remains much as it was before. This is a resilient dynamic stability that allows a system to absorb a fair bit of change and then return to a stable state. The democracy operates much like that glass of water. Democracies can take a fair bit of stirring, shaking, addition of new elements, and yet the rule of law is like the glass. The rule of law that kind of contains and bounds acceptable behavior manages to keep things in order despite the changes and the disruption. Now, if we want to know why China responded the way it did to the Hong Kong protests, one thing I would refer you to is an excellent book recently completed by Yangshun Shu of HKUST on protests in mainland China, in which he looked at how the Chinese government weighed the costs of different kinds of responses to protests in the mainland. China's government has a range of responses, from disciplining local party officials to acting against the leaders of protest, or more widely responding with waves of arrests. And so it turns out that if you look closely, China has been very careful in calculating the costs and gains of different kinds of response to protest. Very clearly here in Hong Kong, the Chinese government calculated the costs and decided that asking for harsh, severe repression would be too costly. Now, you can say this is in part because China is interested in improving its position and its influence in the world and wants to have a favorable view. And I think that is part of it. But I think more than that, we need to understand the value that Hong Kong has for China. Now, in order to understand that value today, I think it's changing, and we should look at what's happening in China's economy. China's economy has just completed what I call the first phase of emerging market growth, EM 1.0, if you will. In this stage, economic growth depends largely on commodity processing and labor-intensive assembly and manufacturing. You pull a lot of coal, iron, oil out of the ground, build things with it, and use a lot of your available labor, disciplined, effective, organized. You get industrialization. You take a country that had been primarily agricultural, make it an industrial power. It becomes urbanized and builds a massive infrastructure. This yields rapid economic growth of the kind China has enjoyed. But once this process is done, you can no longer continue to reap the benefits of urbanization once urbanization levels have reached 70% or so. You can no longer gain from industrialization once you've moved most of your labor force into secondary sectors. So to avoid a middle income trap, you need to shift to emerging market 2.0. This means growth that is based on finance, design, marketing, innovation, leading edge engineering, a society that typically operates with managers and civil servants with graduate and professional training. Obviously, this sounds much more like Hong Kong. And indeed, the developed countries of East Asia, North America, and Europe have completed this movement and are now knowledge-based economies. And China is at the point where it is seeking to make that move from the industrialized EM1 to the knowledge-based EM2. Now, this provides a great opportunity for Hong Kong. After all, Hong Kong provided financial capital and trade prowess to China's EM1. Hong Kong now has the opportunity to provide the intellectual capital to lead China's move into a knowledge-based society. Hong Kong has the potential to be China's leading innovation center and a source of knowledge of other societies and global institutions. And as China graduates from a country that simply wants to build its economy, to be large enough for other people to take notice, and become further a country that is able to assume a leadership role in the institutions of global governance and the patterns of global trade, it will become vital for Chinese leaders to have a better understanding of societies and governance around the world and of the international institutions that guide international economic growth. And Hong Kong is remarkably powerful in terms of its university leadership within China. China has made it a goal to elevate more of its universities to the global top 100. Well, it's already the case that depending on which rankings you look at, Hong Kong, with less than 0.5% of Greater China's population, has 3 of the top 5 universities in China. Sometimes they're ranked 1, 2, 3, sometimes Peking and Tsinghua come into the top 5, but there's no doubt that Hong Kong has a disproportionate role in leadership among Chinese intellectual institutions. Now, the democratic dilemma as faced by many countries, maximizing Hong Kong's role as an innovation center and leader of a knowledge economy requires success by a combination of Hong Kong's business community, universities, and younger generation working together. But a key element for maximizing innovation is an open and democratic society. We've seen this pretty much across history, wherever societies have been more open and more plural, whether this was Tang China, whether this was the early years of Mughal India, the peak years of the Ottoman Empire, all of those societies became more orthodox and more conformist after the 16th century. Europe became more open and plural. Maximizing innovation requires different points of view to compete and to be freely expressed. Problem, however, is that having democracy requires tolerating periodic protests. It's really difficult to have one without the other. And in fact, I looked this up, of course, before coming here. Article 27 of the Basic Law explicitly protects the rights, I quote, of freedom of speech, of the press, of publication, freedom of association, of assembly, of procession, and of demonstration. And it does that because these practices are essential to the stability of a democratic society. At least from the perspective of people who think about democratic dynamics, we tend to think that protest is not an act of disloyalty. Most often, it's an act of love and affection for one's society and a desire to improve it. Hong Kong benefits certainly from a strong and economically growing China. China similarly benefits from an economically growing Hong Kong. So if protest is aimed at improving conditions in Hong Kong to provide greater opportunities for the young and future progress, That kind of effort should not be seen as disorder or disloyalty, but as an effort to promote a better future for Hong Kong, and I think thus for China as well. Now, I am well aware that the Hong Kong protests were not authorized assemblies, and thus were illegal. Excuse me. And consequently, many of the organizers have been arrested and were willing to be arrested in accordance with the law. Now, in the practice of social protest, being willing to take actions that lead to one's arrest are a way that protesters signal the intensity of their commitment to their cause and their view of the importance of their protest to society. Society then has the option of signaling their response through the degree of punishment imposed and whether the protesters' cause is seen as one that requires some alteration of current or future policies. And so, in a sense, it's almost irrelevant to ask, is there right, is there wrong? What really matters is, what does everyone conclude as a result of what has happened in terms of, excuse me, what needs to be done going forward? The professor I mentioned, I'm sorry, at HKUST, Yang Chong-tsai, is the one who had written about collective protest in China. And it's quite interesting that China took the approach of wait it out for the Hong Kong protests. I had a good feeling they would do so. I wrote a blog about this back in October where I said China would probably just let this burn out of its own accord rather than act harshly, but they would probably also ask the leaders to be arrested because that's typically what they've done in mainland protests. And indeed, as we just saw this week, it appears that that is what is happening. But I don't think the arrests or the end of the protests resolve the problem. What we've really seen here demonstrated is that on the one hand, China will not accept a leader for Hong Kong who they think would not be loyal and supportive of the overall goals of the mainland Chinese government. But at the same time, China has learned that the people of Hong Kong, especially the young people, will not accept a government and leadership that they feel is not responsive to their interests. So both sides face a dilemma. You can't have effective, legitimate leadership in Hong Kong from the perspective of China without a selection process that guarantees some loyalty to China, but you can't have effective, legitimate government from the perspective of Hong Kong's people unless they have some ability to ensure the accountability and responsiveness of that government to their concerns. So, what indeed do you do? Are we just resigned to a cycle of unending struggle and protest? I think there are opportunities here for what we in public policy call democratic design. That is to say, there are many varieties of democratic institutions. It's not the case that it's one size fits all or that somebody has a better system. We have seen parliamentary and presidential systems, centralized and federated systems, first past the post, and various kinds of second and multi-group and multi-party systems work. People continue to design new ways to express suffrage in electoral outcomes through a variety of institutions all the time. Democratic practices are changing and flexible, and they're often modified. There was a lot of concern in this round of protest about the fact that a selection committee is written into the basic law, and it's very clear that China is not going to change that aspect of the basic law. However, I can say that in the United States, not that I would recommend our democratic system for anyone else, I think ours has its own problems, and again, China and Hong Kong need to work out their own future without any interference. But it is useful to reflect upon the fact that the United States does not elect its president by direct vote either. We express our universal suffrage in a more indirect way. We have an electoral college. 538 electors meet in January to vote and choose our president. How does that satisfy the demand for universal popular suffrage? Well, it is not a simple one-to-one process. On rare occasions, the candidate who has the most popular votes has not been chosen as president in the Electoral College. And you would think Americans would get upset about this and say, we've got to get rid of that stupid Electoral College. But we've actually grown quite attached to it because it was designed in such a way that it ensures that even small states can have an impact on the choice of our leader. Large states have a bigger impact, but small states cannot simply be neglected. Every region of the country, every fraction of the popular electorate has the potential to play a role, particularly in key swing states or key jurisdictions. And so in a way, we have adapted the Electoral College to impose a popular accountability on the candidates for president. But we've done that through the role of political parties. Now, there's nothing about political parties in the basic law of Hong Kong. But there's nothing about political parties in the Constitution of the United States either. They developed spontaneously to meet a need to create a bridge between the interests and voice of the American people and the institutions for selecting America's leaders. And it is through the process by which political parties have a major role in the choice of members of the Electoral College, and there's grown up a relationship between members of the Electoral College, candidates for our chief executive, and membership in political parties, that people can use their votes, use their party organizations to impose a popular choice through the mechanism of the Electoral College. Now, it may be that some element of design in Hong Kong, increasing the role of political parties in choosing members of the voting commission, or perhaps in having political parties play a bigger role in the choosing of candidates within the commission. I don't know. I wouldn't even make a suggestion. I'd simply say that political parties have played a very effective role in bridging popular demands and institutions that were designed to create a certain institutional boundary between direct electoral choice and a more functional constituency-based kind of outcome. Now, the beauty of the system, and I think this is an issue that really is important for Hong Kong, the beauty of the system is often not what it demands or forces people to do, but what it prevents from happening. That is, if the Electoral College excuse me, forces a candidate to achieve support of a large enough group, while at the same time allowing people who feel they might be overlooked or left out to prevent a candidate from winning who would ignore their interests, then it has worked very effectively. One of the odd things about the United States now is that for a candidate to win in the primaries, they sometimes have to tilt a little more to the left or the right. But when it comes to the general election and the Electoral College, they have to move back toward the center. I think the challenge for the leadership of Hong Kong today is to devise a set of institutions under the Basic Law that will prevent candidates from emerging as chief executive who are unacceptable to Beijing, but will also prevent candidates from emerging who are unacceptable to the popular desires of the people of Hong Kong. It is a tough balance, but I think there are opportunities to reconcile the desire for popular choice with the election committee by increasing the role of political parties or other mechanisms while still retaining that election committee. And I think China will be patient and let Hong Kong work out such procedures because the alternative is simply Hong Kong becoming more and more difficult to govern and losing those golden eggs, those innovation ideas, those sources of progress that China clearly values. Excuse me. Just this week, for example, China announced that they wanted to triple the number of patents for China. And China wants to have more global brands. Let me see if I've got one here. Excuse me. This is my HSBC card. I keep some of my money in an HSBC account, because it's the local global bank. I do a lot of lecturing in places around the world, from Moscow to Istanbul to Hong Kong, and there's almost always a branch of HSBC. Excuse me. But it is one of the rare Hong Kong brands that is globally known and highly visible. There's no reason, actually, I think, that Hong Kong shouldn't aim to have more nationally branded companies, shouldn't be even more of a center of venture capital than it is today. Hong Kong should be the technological leader in everything from smart buildings and smart electrical grids to innovative use of water resources and power, innovative food and waste processing. There are all kinds of frontiers in which Hong Kong is well positioned to show itself off as the city with the highest quality of living in China. Perhaps Singapore, I know, has people here, but competing with Singapore for highest quality of living of any city in Asia. Now, there are challenges. One is to create that governing structure that provides leaders with support of the business community, the mainland, intellectual professional leaders, additional constituency, and the young within that framework. But I started this talk by highlighting the global economic malaise and the problems it had posed for young people as the background to this global protest wave. So beyond these immediate political issues raised by the protests, I think the real challenges for Hong Kong are often economic, providing leadership for China in a variety of quality of life issues, not only reducing pollution and energy waste, but also rethinking labor, providing opportunities for the younger generation and all of Hong Kong to improve their lives, providing high quality and accessible public services and amenities, something that in many Western countries is in danger of disappearing with rising inequality. Hong Kong should create a vibrant culture and environment for creativity and innovation. I mentioned the superficial similarities between San Francisco and Hong Kong at the beginning of my talk. There's no reason Hong Kong shouldn't resemble San Francisco more in becoming an incubator of innovative companies and a center for creativity. And it's also vital to reduce the perceptions of economic inequality and injustice. Now, I say the perceptions here, and that's, you might say, why are you talking about the perceptions of inequality? Why don't you focus on real injustices? Well, the answer is, when it comes to injustice, perception is everything. In fact, the research of another Hong Kong UST scholar, Xiaogong Wu, has shown that even if in Hong Kong economic inequality is higher than in mainland China, the perception of inequality and injustice is often greater in the mainland. Why is that? Well, if you see a lot of inequality, but you feel that you live in a society that is open and has opportunity and that you can advance yourself, the inequality is a challenge for you to overcome. It's a measure against which you test your prowess. But it's not the result of injustice. However, if you live in a society where you feel avenues of progress are blocked, that government favors those who are already in a dominant position, and even worse, if you feel those in a dominant position are feather-bedding themselves through corrupt practices, then you may perceive the system as enormously unjust, even if the objective amount of inequality is moderate. It all depends on whether you feel outcomes are responsive to individual effort and if the underlying processes are fair and just. If so, the resultant inequality is usually acceptable. This is true in America, in Brazil, in Mexico. As long as people feel the opportunity is there, they will feel they live in a just society. The real problem is the current economic malaise is leaving a lot of young people, whether it's in Greece and Spain or Hong Kong and New York, with the feeling that they are losing that opportunity. And that gives rise to these perceptions of economic inequality and injustice. So let me leave you with the thought that I think Hong Kong's real task is to demonstrate that Hong Kong can combine stability and progress, and that its own system, including rule of law that respects the right to peaceful protest, is vital to the success of the one country, two systems model. And by showing China and the world that Hong Kong can succeed with its own system, within the rule of basic law. I think Hong Kong will contribute to China's success, but even more to its own success and the support of its own people. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions in the time that remains.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing such insights with us in the most timely manner. I'd like to follow up on your reference to the role of political parties, because what sets Hong Kong's protests apart from the rest of the world are the contradictions under the one country, two systems formula, with the one country being a communist one-party state. Now, you refer to the role of political parties in the electoral process. What do you think of the idea of bringing able-bodied, capable members of the political party into the governance, into the government as ministers? Although, of course, under the basic law, Hong Kong is supposed to be an executive-led government. The chief executive is not going to be selected by political parties.
Right.
But in spite of that, is it possible to bring the political parties and able-bodied members, of course subject to approval of Beijing, into the governance, the real governance of Hong Kong, in the government as ministers?
Right. Well, if you go to Beijing and talk to China's leaders about the National People's Congress, they're very eager to point out that there are minority parties represented there. They are small and ineffectual, to be sure. But it is interesting that the National People's Congress itself has been flexing its muscles and taking a somewhat larger role. Now, the last 2 years, we've seen Xi Jinping consolidate his personal authority to a greater degree than previous leaders. But this may not diminish the role of the NPC. We'll have to see. So, given that ferment in China, thank you, I think China would adopt a wait-and-see response if political parties were to play a greater role. There is, after all, nothing in the basic law that prohibits candidates for executive choosing to discuss or affiliate in some way with positions of particular parties. Now, in America, the issues of political parties often come down to where's the money? Who is going to support things? So it's not going to be the case that political parties can simply float in the air. There will have to be some understanding with the business community, the young generation, political and intellectual leaders that will bound the role of political parties in a way that leads to responsible competition. And here's where parties are often helpful, in the generation of new ideas, as parties compete for power through platforms and trying to win both popular support and financial support. So again, this is up to the many communities in Hong Kong, but it would not surprise me, looking at what's happened in South Korea, in Taiwan, and even what may be happening a little tiny bit in mainland China, if in all of these countries, political parties have a stronger relationship with leaders and with the political process of choosing those leaders.
Thank you very much, David. I was delighted to hear earlier that David got a taste of the CS that was fired during the protests. It looks like he's fully recovered. Let me introduce myself. My name's Steve Wordsworth. I'm a chief superintendent in the police, participant in these seminars. And one of your arguments is on comparing how the protests were dealt with is that you say there's a mirror in terms of the arrest action with what's been done in Hong Kong and what was done in China. I just wonder how you believe that mechanism works, because from my perspective as a frontline police officer, I don't see that mechanism. The decision to arrest is made by the officers on the ground based on circumstances, and then it goes through the due process of the courts, as is going on in the moment. So where do you perceive that mechanism is, and how does it work?
Good question. First of all, I do want to commend the Hong Kong police, who I thought over a very long period of difficult situation in trying to keep order were remarkably restrained and respectful of the rights of protesters. And again, I actually did a paper a few years ago talking about the changes in the way mainland China responded to protest. And I pointed out there are kind of two different formats of police response to popular disorders. In democratic policing, the rights of the protesters are respected, lethal force is avoided, containment of the protest and prevention of damage to property is one of the main goals of police. And arrests usually focus on those who played a leadership role rather than a kind of mass arrest and sentence. That is, if you look at a country like Egypt or, excuse me, China in the 1980s, the response to disorder often included the use of lethal force, imprisonment of hundreds or sometimes thousands, the handing down of very harsh punitive sentences. But China actually has been responding to protest within the mainland in a more calculated way, often using the protest to force change on local party officials, limiting arrests, limiting the use of violence. So when I said that what I saw happen in Hong Kong was similar, I meant that it was conforming even more than on the mainland, but still to the ideals of democratic policing rather than to the authoritarian notion that any protest is a mortal threat and needs to be dealt with as harshly as possible. Now, with regard to who chooses who is arrested, police officers do choose to make field arrests, but it's also true that prosecution offices can issue arrest warrants for people who are identified as persons of interest. And both these processes are occurring. I think that's in accord with the law and perfectly natural. The same thing occurs in all mature democracies. As I say, what's interesting is when you have a country with common law, there's a great deal of discretion for the prosecutors and judges in how they deal with those who are arrested for protests. And judges and juries are allowed to weigh what they think were the provocations, the costs, the degree of disruption. Now, I mean, protest is disruptive. There's no question about it. That's part of the message that protesters want to deliver. And what I remind people is we suffer disruptions all the time. When an important state visitor comes to town, streets are closed. When we have festivals, we have closings of streets and shops. When we have construction, as is going on in front of my hotel, large areas of the street are inconvenient for stores and for people. You know, we don't live in an ideal world. Any blooming, changing, diverse society is going to have disruptions. What's important is to keep them minimally damaging and have them contribute to a future improvement. And I like to think that in many cases, social protests can be the kind of disruption that, though costly and unpleasant in the short run, can lead to better outcomes in the long run.
Could I supplement with a second question? And
If no one else is in line at the moment.
Occupy movements generally tend to spend a lot of their energy holding meetings, and in the end of the day, that's where their energy goes. Now, we saw that to some extent in Hong Kong. How do you see it morphing then in Hong Kong? Because the Occupy movement seems to have dissipated itself. So where does it go from here?
Well, that's not for me to say. I don't know. I'm curious to watch. What I can tell you is that the tactic of occupying public space has become a more favorite tactic. We saw it in Occupy Tahrir Square, Occupy Maidan Square. In those cases, a very harsh military response helped promote a more radical turn, and those events morphed into revolutionary conflicts. In other cases, like Gezi Park in Turkey, you had an occupation. The response was excessive at first, but then ratcheted down, and then the response, as you say, there was continued occupation, it wears out. The problem with occupation responses is they're initially dramatic. They allow protesters to show their resolve by remaining in place, but if the government adopts a kind of hands-off, let them do what they want to do, there's nothing much more the protesters can do, and generally this occupation usually dies out. So essentially, protesters are learning the limits of this tactic as well. Now, one of the things that we do see happening is protesters are learning to use cell phones and social media to organize flash and pop-up protests. These are less disruptive, but they keep things going. So maybe the next stage in a protest will be to have a protest in a different part of Hong Kong every Saturday or Friday and not let people know where it's going to be, right? So it'll be unexpected and disruptive, but it'll be gone before there's a chance for the authorities to react strongly. Now, whether that will provoke political thought and debate or not, I don't know. But it's another option and opportunity. So I'd simply say This tactic has probably been exhausted for now, but there are other modules in the toolkit of social protest, and it's a toolkit that people are experimenting with and continuing to grow. So you and the police will have your hands full probably in also learning to respond. Excellent.
35 years, I've done my time.
Congratulations, my sir.
One comment, and then sort of I've been thinking about something you said. I'm not sure I'll be able to formulate it into a good question, but I'll take the risk. So one comment is a lot of the research on the collapse of Eastern Europe argued that communist systems could build cars, but they couldn't innovate. And that one of the big explanations, there's a lot of research, as you know, you could throw that into your presentation. A lot of the research that explains the collapse of Eastern Europe and even the Soviet Union is that they could build a lot of stuff, but they couldn't microchip, they couldn't do it in a very innovative way. So I think that that's an important point for China. What I kept hearing from you, which got me thinking, was the reference to democratic society and democratic government. And I think that that's a big deal here in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has been a democratic society for a long time. Maybe not an equitable society, but it's been pretty democratic. And to a certain extent, I think part of the reaction of Hong Kong society is it feels the threat to that. So 2003, the national security law, 2011, 2012, the education, a national education, and this to a certain extent, but this was less a restriction on people's freedoms that they already had, but what people experience in part is a threat to the democratic society. Now we're trying to talk about the movement towards a democratic government, and that's where I think people, again, this is something new, where I think people feel restricted. So my question is almost like, if China would just say, oh, if China were just cool it and relax, so Hong Kong people don't feel so Chinese, so Hong Kong people feel reasonably like a Hong Konger, right? Could China live with that? And then the Hong Kong citizens would have to say, we'll live with a less democratic government.
I don't think either could live with that, actually. China, the Han people of China have been taught for the last few decades that they have been humiliated and kept down by outsiders. They are proud that China has risen up and is again a major player in the world economy, and they hope in the political leadership of the world. For the political leadership and authority and weight of China in the world to be contested by rebellious provinces, whether it's Xinjiang and Tibet or Taiwan and Hong Kong, is not tolerable for them. Now, that said, I think that also makes the loyalty issue more important than the systems issue. Provided that Taiwan and Hong Kong see themselves as Chinese and contributing to the economic growth and prestige of China in the world, it's okay if they have, in their own little way, more democratic procedures than the mainland. And I think that is the more acceptable compromise. And to the extent that Taiwan has decided not to openly challenge the one country, two systems model and simply try and be as successful as it can, both with its democratic procedures, which, as we've just seen, dealt a blow to the Kuomintang, but also with its economy. Taiwan remains optimistic that as they build economic ties and demonstrate the value of their system, China will see the benefits of it. Now, I also do research on processes of democratization, and it's difficult to explain and understand. Why do some countries become democratic, others not? Many countries adopt democratic institutions and they fail. Other countries manage to sustain democratic institutions decade after decade, enjoy economic ups and downs. I've actually come to conclude now that the character of a society, rather than its formal institutions, are most important. And that the difference between an authoritarian society and a democratic society, it's not just the difference between having more elections or more openness. It's as fundamental as the difference between a caterpillar and a butterfly. They're just different. You can pin wings on a caterpillar, it doesn't make it a butterfly. You can stick democratic formal institutions on a hierarchical authoritarian society. But if people are too dominated by social and economic hierarchy to feel confident expressing themselves, or even to have access to information or the ability to organize with their peers, those democratic institutions will never function. But the reverse is also true. Once a society has morphed and become a butterfly, meaning which people have lots of cross-cutting horizontal ties, they're used to talking to each other, discussing issues. They're used to making decisions about their own life, how they spend their money, how they'll invest, where they will get the best returns, who can they bargain with, who can they work with. Once all of those social processes are in place, it's very hard to avoid democratic institutions from continuing to function. Now, you can cut the wings off the butterfly by removing those institutions, but just as that kills the butterfly, that also kills the energy and the progressive character of the society and returns it to a kind of inert, rigid, authoritarian state. So I think China has come to realize, I mean, China has sent more young people to study abroad in Europe, in America, and elsewhere than any other country in the world. China's leaders have all studied abroad. They've sent their children to live abroad. They understand that foreign societies that are deeply democratic are different and will not be easily brought to conform to the current one-party Chinese system. Even though it's been effective in lifting China from a primitive agrarian economy to an industrial economy, they know that what they aspire to is to be more like the wealthy knowledge economies that surround them. So I think the compromise that China will make is they will demand loyalty of Hong Kong and Taiwan, but they will accept the one country, two systems as long as that one country is primary. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, please.
Hi, I'm not young enough to be a student, but I think I'm one of the few people in this room who was born after the 1980s. So in Hong Kong, we call them the after 80s. So I have a lot of friends who participated in the protests, and I just want to share some observations based on the conversations that I've had with friends. I personally did not participate in the protests, but I have lots of friends who went there. And I have two observations with regard to social mobility and social class. So I think you very rightly pointed out that globally, among young people, there's this anxiety with regard to economic inequality and social immobility. And I just want to point out, first of all, that I think in Hong Kong, this is complicated by the fact that Hong Kong young people see China getting more and more prosperous, but not necessarily taking part in it and not necessarily having any personal gain or social mobility that comes along with it. I was very fortunate. I went to a good school in Hong Kong, went to an Ivy League university in the US, went to Oxford in the UK, came back, worked at an investment bank. So, but a lot of the times among young people, there's a lot of Hong Kong young people who feel that the university places at Harvard and Stanford are getting taken away by mainland Chinese students. Even in Hong Kong, like the top students at Hong Kong UST or Hong Kong U, from my understanding, are always mainland Chinese students.
Right.
And then when you're going into finance, which has been the bread and butter of Hong Kong's society for so many years, it's increasingly hard for me as a Hong Konger to get a job there because increasingly investment banks are preferring mainland Chinese students who have mainland Chinese connections and are accustomed to mainland Chinese culture. So there's a real sense that there's a jealousy that accompanies that anxiety that is experienced globally. And secondly, I just wanted to point out the observation that whether we want to acknowledge it or not, it seems that social class, whether it's born social class or acquired social class, has a role to play in your stance toward the protests. There's those who were born into like humble backgrounds, and those who were born into more well-established families. And I just wonder whether there's any political science research that has been conducted on the role of whether you're born social status or acquired social status, and how that affects your participation in such protests.
In regard to that last question, we find that the leadership of social protest frequently comes from those who have been most successful. People who are, like yourself, in positions where they're able to reflect on what they see around them. They are reasonably secure from good middle to upper class backgrounds, but they have had an experience that makes them acutely sensitive to what they see as injustice in their societies, to the point where they're willing to take a stand on behalf of other people who they feel have been blocked or kept back. Now, the rank and file, the majority of people who participate in a protest, are one step down from that. They tend to be people who have aspirations to better their lives, but find that they, for one reason or another, have not been able to achieve their goals, and they blame the political system for that, and that's why they're willing to give their energy to protest. Then the very poorest, those who come from the most difficult backgrounds, are often not participants in protests. They don't have the time. They've got to spend most of their effort surviving, providing for their family. They may get involved at the stage when a protest gets very, very large. So much so that ordinary work routines are disrupted and people can leave their jobs, for example, without a penalty. But for people who are very dependent on every day's job and every week's paycheck, they're unlikely to join a protest and risk being arrested or losing income for their families. So there is a class element to different positions within the protest. But again, it depends on also, what is the situation in society? What we find in the United States, protests about the environment tend to draw a higher class person from all ranks of the movement, whereas protests about racial issues, as we found now, they draw more heavily from people who feel the sting of racial injustice, and they are generally in the kind of third quartile of the income distribution. So it's a good question in sociology. I offer that you fund some additional research at one of the Hong Kong University sociology departments, and we will get even better answers for you. But it's a very good question.
So we have time for maybe just one more.
I think Provost Shea.
Jack, I enjoy your talk, and I think you have touched upon quite a few aspects. I think, first of all, one thing is Taiwan's equivalent embassy in the Washington, D.C. raised a flag yesterday, which invited a strong protest from Beijing. So it's not settled. Okay, and certainly that typify, I think, specify the difficulties and certainly the core of the issue. But the other thing you mentioned, which certainly I think also relevant here is after sending and receiving many people to go abroad and going back to mainland, they have so far chosen not to destabilize the existing political system. Of course, that is worth discussing also. Essentially, I suppose there is a competition between what is possible for one's future and what's the tolerance of the system. But to Hong Kong, I think that's also relevant to your earlier point that considering the economic, social opportunities, and then you look at Taiwan, Tel Aviv, many other things, and there's a very wide spectrum of level of democracy. That alone doesn't really suppress the protest. And the level of the disagreement doesn't really correlate with the level of democracy either.
Right.
Right. I think in that context, Hong Kong has a lot of challenge in terms of system design. And it's also a matter of degree of freedom, I suppose.
Well, let me say two things. First of all, protest is part of democracy. It's never going to go away altogether. It can be more disruptive, less disruptive, more frequent, less frequent. But the essence of democracy is disagreement. And there will be disagreements that are greater and more painful than others, and protest will erupt. Secondly, I would say this one country, two systems model, it's brand new. It is a work in progress. And both the Chinese and the Hong Kong and Taiwanese are feeling their way forward, trying to figure out how much latitude do we have within this system? What can we change? What do we have to keep? So you're going to see challenges, responses, popular protests, state actions. The real question is, where do the boundaries lie?
Yes.
How far can things go? And so far, we've seen quite a lot of interesting dissent. The sunflower protests in Taiwan resulted in a political change and China changing its approach. The protests here about the moral education actually led to a significant pushback and change. So I expect we will continue to see
I agree.
a lot of this.
I think it's a form of negotiation. In a
Yeah,
way,
it is a form of negotiation.
But my question
right?
is, another sensitive topic which you have not touched upon is foreign influence.
Yeah, I avoided that.
Okay, and I'd like to see your comment on this. I think this is in a sense, is an elephant in the room. It is very sensitive. It's also very important. That adds a lot of complexity to this,
Right.
and which touch upon some of the core things you mentioned. I'd like to hear your view.
Well, as someone who works in Washington, I can tell you how stunned I have been by the current American administration's approach to foreign policy, which is extraordinarily reactive rather than proactive. President Obama entered office with what he believed was a strong mandate to reverse the aggressive interventionist actions of the Bush administration. Obama felt that Bush's actions in the Middle East, but also elsewhere, had brought America into disrepute, had been ineffective, and had often created worse problems. Now, once Obama entered office, he found on the one hand that the actions of his predecessor had stirred up a hornet's nest of security issues. You couldn't simply put the jihadists back in the bottle by ignoring them. So drone campaigns continued, cybersecurity issues continued, Guantanamo Bay was not closed as expected. So a lot of things that the Bush administration did were continued, but not out of a desire to do so, kind of a default position. Where possible, Obama thought it was important to draw down troops in Iraq, draw down troops in Afghanistan, not engage in Syria, not follow up initial efforts in Libya, and certainly so much so in the beginning that he felt necessary to pivot later to kind of stand back from the issues of Japan and China and Taiwan and let those countries, as mature countries, solve them themselves. But the result, as I say, being in Washington, we're constantly seeing the American government shocked by what happens. We didn't expect a revolution in Ukraine. We thought that European powers were signing an agreement with Yanukovych and Putin that was going to work things out. We had no idea that Yanukovych was going to run off in the middle of the night because his security forces deserted him. Certainly all of these protests that we've seen in Taiwan and Hong Kong came as a complete shock to America. We had no policy in place to think about how to respond. We still have no idea really what's the best way to deal with the rising and proud China. I mean, I have a lot of friends who go touring in China as Americans, and they say, they keep asking why we are doing X, Y, and Z. And we have to say, we're not doing anything. We're trying to figure out what to do, and we're always lagging behind events. Now, that may be a bad thing. I mean, a lot of people feel the world would be safer, and we recently had the strange spectacle of Iran asking the United States for help in suppressing the Islamic State. Now, if Iran, who has been angry at the U.S. for decades for fearing the U.S. wanted to somehow subvert its government, says, well, maybe we need American help after all, maybe that's a signal that America stepped too far back from the world and that people want a stronger American global presence. But certainly all the evidence we've seen from the last 5 or 6 years suggests that if anything, America is playing a less interventionist, less strategic role in the world, is being more passive and more reactive. And I think that applies very much to America's role, which is basically absent in any of these 2012-14 global urban protests.
How about the British?
I defer to our distinguished guests for that.
Okay, one last question.
Jack, I have a question now. As you know, if you looked at the initial demands of the students or the protesters, it turned out that the initial demand was also the final demand. Mm-hmm. In other words, during this 80 or whatever number of days of occupation and protest, there was never a lowering of their demand, when in fact, both the sympathizers and the detractors who were on the outside were hoping that there would be some sort of intermediate target that would be raised so that there would be some negotiation. Because I think that almost everyone, including maybe even the students, know that their initial demand was really untenable or not achievable. I guess I'm asking you in a scholarly study is that if you look at other social movements, is that always the case that the demand is always, something that is impossible to attain, and that any sort of moderation won't come until the protest is over, rather than during the middle of the process, they'll say, well, all right, fine. If I don't get that, how about this?
Right.
And then comes a process of negotiation. So how is this comparable worldwide? I guess that's my question.
For protest in democratic societies, what we have just seen is not uncommon. Now, if in a democratic society you get a very radical demand that we want to overthrow the government or we want to ban opposition parties, that group usually loses sympathy very quickly and is dealt with by security forces and no one sheds a tear. But if you have a group voice demands that even though they are strong, we want to ban nuclear power plants, we want to change the way the government is elected, if there is some broad sympathy for that, it's likely that the government will act with restraint and that they will think about what to do. Now, the protesters don't know for sure whether the opposition is unyielding until they've had the experience of creating a disruption and seeing what the response is. Now, if the protesters say, we want X, and the government says, you can't have X, they may say, well, we really want X. And so the government will say, well, how costly will it be to give this up? And the government may say, no, you can't have X. And then the protesters will think, is it worth trying to escalate this further? And then the protesters thought, should we maybe occupy government buildings rather than just public space? That would have been a mistake. I'm glad it didn't happen. But there is this thinking and negotiation. And if after 2 months, the government still says, you can't have X, and the protesters that, well, it would be too costly and counterproductive to try and do more, it fizzles. However,
So they would rather fizzle than offer Y.
yes. However, what usually happens after the fizzle is if the government wants to prevent further feelings of delegitimacy and exclusion, they'll say, you can't have X. But let's talk about Y, because there may be some things we can do on Y that appeal to the same issue or concerns. Can't have X, we already settled that, but come talk to me about something else, because we don't want you to feel that we are simply going to ignore you, deny your interests, treat you as invalid, non-significant people. That's the risk that government takes after the fizzle. So I expect there was, particularly for the government of Hong Kong, which is caught in the middle, and the government of Hong Kong wants to be legitimate and respected, but needs support from China. I think the government of Hong Kong is strongly motivated to start talking about Y and Z in order to distract anxiety about X while still reassuring the young people of Hong Kong that, yes, you have a future. We do want to make some changes that will give you a stake in your society. That's what I hope will occur, but I think it's also often observed and reasonable to expect.
Well, I guess that's the last question. I'm afraid we're constrained for time, and we need to leave the premises for another function by the owners. So, but I'd like to thank most sincerely our distinguished speaker today, Professor Goldstone, who has really opened up a Pandora's box and yet hadn't been able to handle all these tough questions with grace and with wisdom. So let us thank you.
Thank you.